if it was an internal examination, I can actually use my hands to help them find the sensation that they're
Mm.
looking for. A lot of what helps people understand that movement or feel that movement is knowing what those muscles are meant to do. We don't often think about our pelvic floors, and I think we can sort of take the movement for granted for that reason. The biggest thing for me was tracking down what I was feeling as well. This was a really interesting sort of learning experience, and I would have these days during the month where I felt kind of like down and flat and like I didn't have very much motivation, and then some days where I felt like I could literally take on the world, and it was very
Mm.
confusing.
Hello and welcome back to PA Chalk Up. Today we have Amanda. Hi Amanda, how you doing?
Great, how are you?
I'm good. If you just give us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you got to where you are.
My name's Amanda Dawson. I'm a physical therapist. I specialize in pelvic health and running and gait analysis. I went to school in Canada in Guelph. I did my undergrad, and then I did my master's of physical therapy at Queen's University. And I now practice in downtown Toronto at a couple of private clinics, and been doing that for about almost 6 years now. So yeah, that's me.
Nice. We were talking a little bit offline where we were sort of getting into the pelvic health area that you do and the gait analysis. If you just break those two areas and sort of let us know what your interests were originally and how you got to really dive into those two specific areas.
Yeah, for sure. I started with pelvic health around maybe a couple months after I graduated, actually. So it was pretty quick after graduation. I was trying to figure out how to treat low back issues and was just not understanding anything about the core, anything about how we create stability, how do we create strength, how do we produce force from your abdominal cavity. And so I ended up taking this course with one of my colleagues in how to treat pelvic health conditions. It also gives me the ability to do internal examinations, which is a protected act in Canada. And so basically, we can help with all kinds of muscular issues of the pelvic floor in that area. So it can be issues where we have too much tension. There might be stuff related to pain. There can be stuff related to chronic pelvic pain in maybe the scope of like PCOS, endometriosis, that kind of stuff, as well as, and one of the areas that I love the most, dealing with women throughout pregnancy and then postpartum and then return to sport. And then the gait analysis stuff I got into a little more recently, maybe about 3 years ago. I started with that. I took a course through a Quebec-based provider called the Running Clinic,
Mm.
La Clinique du Coeur, and they have all kinds of educational pieces around the world. They do some online stuff, but yeah, I can't recommend them enough. I basically did the introductory gait analysis
Mm.
program with them. I'm actually taking another course this May on lower body, lower extremity injuries. But that kind of started around the time that the pandemic happened. And so
Mm.
it coincided with this like huge burst of people getting into running because that was all we had, really, right? And so I don't know how, but just sort of like it worked out really nicely for me because I got all of these people who were just starting running. They're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not sure if
Mm.
I'm running correctly, if I'm exposing myself to injury, that kind of stuff. And there weren't that many places that you could do gait analysis at the time. And so yeah, that area has been super interesting, and it's actually been fun to sort of like mesh those two areas together in how our lower extremity, our feet, um, kind of coincides with what's going on in the abdominal cavity and the pelvic floor. So that's been a bit of an area that I'm quite interested in, and I've been lucky. I have a lot of people around me who are
Mm.
also interested in that, and so I get to kind of learn from them. I work with some people who do more specifically like rehabilitation Pilates and have a lot of kind of like
Oh.
information on how to strengthen um, and how it relates to all of the stuff going down on the leg and the nerves in that area and everything. So yeah, it's an area of interest, and I feel like it's just kind of trendy right now as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been really fun to learn about, as well as see the like explosion of information that's available in
Yeah.
both of those areas, pelvic health and gait analysis. So yeah,
No, I do agree in the way that both are very related. The feet are such a like foundation for like anything that you do, and like every sensation that you get from like grabbing and feeling and pushing against that floor can
totally.
directly go into the core as well. Is that something that you found that meshes together in a way that by treating one you see improvements in the other?
Sometimes, yeah. I think, let's say one example as far as pelvic health goes that I see a lot is urge incontinence, or like the feeling of having to
Hmm.
go to the bathroom too frequently or urgently. One technique that we often use is heel raises, or just like
Okay.
calf raises, as a distraction technique. And so I guess that's an example of like kind of
Hmm.
using one area to influence the other. Basically, we're activating some of the sacral nerves through doing calf raises, and we distract your brain from thinking, oh my God, I'm going to pee my pants. And it kind of helps just redirect the information that you're getting. And so your brain starts to focus on, oh, we have to push through these muscles rather than, you know, create this sensation that you have to go
Hmm.
to the bathroom so urgently. So, and the other thing that I often see is maybe not as much the feet, but the hips in relationship to pelvic floor. We know about internal rotation restrictions and how that can influence what's happening inside the pelvic floor, and pain related to usually obturator internus and that kind of stuff. So I've been able to influence pelvic floor with kind of what the lower extremity is doing in a few different ways for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we just back up a little bit and go into some of the pelvic health? Because you mentioned that you sort of do assessments for it as well. So how do you sort of diagnose certain types of issues that are occurring within that person? How do you then treat and sort of make out and build out their program?
Yeah. I think if I'm using one example, let's say I have somebody who has pelvic organ prolapse after delivering a baby or something like that. Basically, their assessment is usually going to look like a general postural assessment. We usually look at how you breathe, how your back moves, are you strong in the hips? Are you able to create a core contraction? Is there separation of the abdominals, like rectus abdominis, that kind of stuff? So that's all from the outside and might depend based on like what the person is reporting subjectively a little bit. So we look at that, and then the thing that I mentioned earlier about being rostered, we call it in Ontario, to do internal exams, is that we can do a vaginal exam that would usually include looking at the muscles of the pelvic floor from the inside. And so we get a good look at like how do you use those muscles? Do you have proper reflex reactions? Are you able to control your intra-abdominal pressure, which is something that we know a lot of people can't and maybe don't even know a lot about. It's talked about a lot in powerlifting and in
Hmm.
weightlifting. Obviously, we think about those belts and how we can assist in those ideas, but yeah, it tells us a little bit about like if you cough, are you able to control the pressure that is created by that cough? And then do you have any areas of tenderness? So I'll usually just use a hand. There's nothing scary. There's no speculum or any like scary things like a pap exam you see in the gynecologist's office, but it's usually pain free. And the assessment tells us a lot about just basically how those muscles are functioning from an internal perspective. Is the diaphragm working with the pelvic floor to create this kind of like piston action that we
Hmm.
know is supposed to be happening? And then from there, if not, obviously we try to start training those movements, whether that starts with like proprioception, maybe muscle release occasionally, where kind of like if you get someone to release your neck muscles, it's the same idea. Those muscles need occasionally to be released or have trigger points worked on in order for you to have access to them. Sometimes there's too much tension, so we need to bring the tension down in order for you to create a proper concentric and eccentric contraction. So yeah, once you have an idea of how those muscles move and what it's supposed to feel like, then we can start training more functional movements. So a lot of the times it'll look like creating what people know as a Kegel, or a pelvic floor
Hmm.
contraction, lifting and relaxing. And then from there, we often do things that are more relevant to their day to day. So I'll often have them do a pelvic floor contraction while they're hip hinging almost like a deadlift.
Okay.
And then I'll have them do the same thing maybe in a squat, or perhaps they'll do something with like a side plank hold, stuff that's kind of engaging sort of the hip movements and like pelvic stability and control at the same time as using that pelvic floor musculature. And what does that feel like? Are you able to maintain that movement? And mostly we're looking for control. All the stuff about pelvic floor that we talk about in general is like, can you control those muscles in various movements? Um, and then, for example, like higher level stuff, I guess, if that person was wanting to go back to something like running, we'd often do all of these like strength things, make sure that they have like basic, can you hold something
Mhm.
isometrically? And then from there, there's return to running protocols that already exist in some of the research. And so I'll kind of pick and choose, you know, 6 or 7 movements and then just sort of watch them do those, obviously pairing it with like a subjective response, like do you feel heaviness, do you feel discomfort, are you feeling like you're going to urinate, that kind of thing. And mostly watching exactly how do you accomplish those tasks, how do you do a plank, how do you do a single leg squat, can you do it repeatedly, can you do it quickly, those kinds of things, in combination with what's happening with the actual pelvis position while you're doing them. And then yeah, if you pass my return to run protocol, then oftentimes we can start getting you into higher intensity movements. Or usually I'll start with like jumping, and then sort of like a running protocol where it's maybe walk, run, intervals, that kind of stuff. And then, yeah, hopefully that's my goal with everyone, is get them back to
Yeah.
doing whatever it is that they want to do. So,
Yeah, you've
yeah.
you've sort of unpacked a lot, and I kind of want to like break this down a little bit. Um,
Totally.
so obviously, Kegels is something that everyone has heard that they need to do or should be doing, but if we're
Yeah.
honest, barely anyone does it. From a starting point, how do you help people sort of really feel what they should be feeling, or how would you describe that exercise to feel?
Yeah. It's, it's always different depending on, um, I suppose, what the person comes in for and what they're ready to do. If it was an internal examination, I can actually use my hands to help them find the sensation that
Mm.
they're looking for. A lot of what helps people understand that movement, or feel that movement, is knowing what those muscles are meant to do. We don't often think about our pelvic floors, and I think we can sort of take the movement for granted for that reason. And so a lot of the times I'll start with education and I'll show them. I have this like pelvis model that has all of the muscles included on it, which I think freaks people out at first. And then I use this crazy anatomy app that everyone loves called Complete Anatomy, as a plug.
I've heard them.
um, yeah, and people love it because I think we just don't think about, especially the pelvic floor, as actual muscles. So knowing what they do, that it's a bowl of musculature that's meant to contract and relax. It holds up all of your pelvic organs. Males and females have them. They're actually anatomically quite similar. And then, yeah, I think just being able to know what you're looking at, what is it?
Mhm.
What is your pelvic floor? Is a good place to start. And then from there, I can use various different cues. So, depending on whether or not we're doing an internal exam with somebody, I'll use various cues, but I have a million of them, a million of them. So, say I was trying to get somebody to like contract properly, because we're just looking for that specific movement. A lot of times I'll use either uh, move as if you're trying to hold in urine, hold in gas, try and imagine you're going into a cold lake and you're having that sort of like
Mm.
zipper reaction. Imagine lifting something up through the vaginal walls or the rectal walls or whatever it is. Some people use the smoothie analogy, like draw a smoothie up through the straw. Whatever lands, honestly, like you have to
Yeah.
have a bunch of them in your back pocket. But even then, like sometimes people struggle with getting that movement, and that happens a lot. So even just being able to put people in different positions is really helpful. Sometimes if we put them in anterior pelvic tilt, it lengthens the pelvic
Mhm.
floor musculature as well as the abdominal wall. So we get a little bit less like rectus abdominis contraction, a little bit more pelvic floor contraction most of the time. Sometimes having people sitting can be helpful because they're then working sort of against gravity to lift up those muscles. Um, and then, yeah, just being able to like play around with different positions with people and know how that might influence their movement
Yeah.
is important. And then just giving them as many cues as possible because Cues land, I'm sure you know this, cues land so
100%.
differently with people. It's interesting to watch how you respond to them. So
100%.
you have
I
to have a
always tell
feel
my
for it.
athletes that if I'm giving out specific instructions and if you don't understand what I'm saying, majority of the time it's not your fault. It's how I'm communicating those cues with you. Like
Totally.
with the different types of learners, you have to cater to everyone, not just like what your cues comfortable are, like what your comfortable cues are. So like
Yeah.
changing up the one things that I love, and this comes more from a squat standpoint, is a pull rip the carpet apart when you're wanting to get that
Yes.
knees to come out instead of valgus. So I usually
I love
get
that
my
one.
athletes to stand and just like pretend there's a rug there and you're just ripping it apart with your sort of heels. And like that
Yeah.
clicks straight away. But like if that doesn't work, then I go to make sure that your knees track with your toes because that's
Hmm.
a visual cue that they can follow and like they can see that what's happening. At like visual cues, sort of written cues as well. Like you have to have a vast library of them.
100%. And then even if sometimes those don't even work so well, sometimes have people like hold their own abdominal wall or like above the
Mm,
pubic area or, like put their hands behind their back and see what you're feeling when you press down into it. So you gotta have like layers and layers of
100%.
cues.
I'm not going to lie. While you were talking through your different cues, I was like doing my Kegel exercises at the same time. And it's like the thing
It
is like
happens all the time.
you can do it like subconsciously. I was just doing them, and then I realized I was doing them, and I was like, "Wait, this is working."
Yeah, there we go.
um,
Yeah, it happens a lot. People do that.
you brought up some like really interesting points as well with the powerlifting community and how that internal pressure can be built up and stored for big lifts.
Mhm.
What are some of your sort of recommendations to make sure that you're adequately engaging all the right muscles for that?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting thing, and I think we chatted a little bit about your distaste for the
Yep.
normalization of urinating while heavy lifting, which is really common. But we were saying,
I
common
will
but not normal.
clarify that it's not that I have any malice towards that. It's an incontinence problem, and this should be addressed because it's
Yeah,
not functioning correctly.
exactly. Yes, yeah. No hate to the people who are having the issue. No, not at all. Just the idea that it's totally fine and we don't worry about it is, I think, somewhat problematic. And just knowing where the issue lies is very important. And so sometimes we can have like that problem specifically is called stress urinary incontinence, and it is basically if you picture the pelvic floor as like a tube of toothpaste and you create a bunch of pressure in your abdominal cavity because you're squeezing or trying to like really push through a lift, you can just allow the contents to come out the bottom. If we don't have proper sort of pushback or sort of, like comparison in terms of like muscle use from the top to the bottom. So something that I mean, it's hard to say, like, is there something I tell people? Because I would want to know exactly why that's happening. We
Mm,
can have stress urinary incontinence for various reasons. Sometimes it is an issue of having too much tension, so that, like I said earlier, you don't have access to those muscles. Like if your biceps kind of all the way contracted, you're just not going to get a very big bicep curl out of that. Or it can be an issue of low tone. Maybe somebody who has not enough muscle contraction, maybe they've had injuries, maybe there's a nerve injury there. And so those muscles are just not online. They're just sort
mhm,
of a little lazy. They're not doing what they're supposed to at the right time. Then the last thing that it could be is an issue of timing. And so are you able to create that contraction at the right time to your intra-abdominal pressure increases? So I want to know more about why it's happening, I suppose, and like get a little bit more of a history on that. But basically, being able to use the pelvic floor at all and understand what that feels like when you're stabilizing is a really important part of that. And so, looking at like um, the things that we talked about as far as once we've done the internal exam, we know the muscles are working. Is it functional? Does it function at the same time as your hip contraction? Are you able to keep that contraction while you're using your hips and your low back and all that jazz? Um, but yeah, I think it has a lot to do with what you understand as normal
mhm.
and what is truly normal in terms of muscle function. And yeah, we see it a lot in female CrossFitters, which if they're not worried about it, then maybe I shouldn't worry about it. But at the same time, I think it's one of those things where um, there's this commercial out there for like a women's diaper or like a women's care product for absorbing urine, and they're like, incontinence is just a part of life, and it drives me absolutely mad because we
Really?
actually have level one grade A evidence for like the methods that we use in public health to help people with incontinence. We have excellent research on these areas, and so it is not only not just a part of life, it's something that we can fix with like great information, and we have a lot of the tools to do that. So it always
100%.
bothers me when people are like, oh, I just pee my pants, it's just normal, that's just how
Yeah,
it
and
is.
that's something that we were talking about, and it's this thing that, like, I'm not saying that women should be embarrassed if it happens, because obviously it's like
No.
it can happen to anyone. Like,
Yeah.
men can get it too. Like, we can just
Oh yeah.
it can just go weak, and that's not the issue that I'm having with incontinence in the gym. What I'm having an issue is that people are praising these women for it, where they should actually be seeking some type of rehabilitation for wherever the issue is. I think
Yeah.
normalizing it's fine. I don't disagree with that. What I'm saying is, like, get it checked, because that is a dysfunction that should be taken care of. Like, if for women who don't have kids and that happens when they have kids, that could be even worse. So
Yeah.
for sake of leading a healthy life, which you're already doing if you're in the gym, that's something that I think should be taken care of. Um, in terms of
And
like,
not only that, but if you had better support from your pelvic floor, we would probably be able to lift more. So if it's just in that context, you can produce more force from a stable surface,
Mhm,
obviously. And so if your pelvic floor is lacking in stability and therefore we have this stress urinary incontinence, it's something to think about as far as performance, even. Like, do we get peak performance out of a muscle group that's not, balanced with the rest of the muscle groups around it? Probably not. Yeah,
100%.
agreed entirely.
And it's this thing of like, there's so many factors that go into lift, and so many muscle engagements, so many different contributing factors to how a lift is happening. Neglecting one, like, you would you wouldn't try and switch off your pec if you're doing bench press.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, it's this idea of like, let's make sure that everything is tight. And like, I often say to my athletes, let's find that breath. When we find that breath, it's
Hmm.
like everything's coming in tight. We're locked in lats, locked in chest, core, legs. Everything's sort of building up that pressure. And I often, going back to our cues, I usually compare that to, like, if you have a Coke can and you shake it, that
Yeah,
pressure gets built up inside. So when we're doing stuff like cleans and snatches, think about that release of that, like, pressure, as you, after shaking the can, opening the can, and everything just explodes out. So it's that
yeah.
idea of like tightening everything. And you shouldn't neglect your pelvic floor just because you don't think about it.
Yes. Yeah, it's just not a visible deficiency, I guess. Like if somebody's got like shoulder instability, we can see that when they get into their press, right? If you have an unstable pelvic floor, a pelvic floor that's not holding things at the right time and in the right way, I can't see that unless you're actually
Hmm.
peeing on the
Yeah.
floor, or if you've got other symptoms, which can come up too. But yeah, it's an area that I think I I certainly don't want anyone to feel shame about. It's just that we can fix these problems and
Mhm.
we have a lot of the information to do it. So
So with
if people
incontinence,
want that, it's out there.
how do you identify it? Like, the different aspects that go into it, and how would you then go about sort of making sure that the people who are suffering from it actually benefit from being like treated from it?
Yeah, I think incontinence can happen in so many different ways. So the one that we just talked about, where there's a lot of pressure buildup and then we urinate, especially during weightlifting, is the stress incontinence. And so we can also have various versions of incontinence. I talked about urge a little bit earlier, which is basically the sensation that you
Hmm.
have to pee immediately, oftentimes related to like the signal in your brain being slightly off or a lot of tension in the pelvic floor. Um, and then we've also got obviously fecal incontinence, that kind of stuff. It's really something that a lot of women come in and women and men. I often see male patients as well with what we call dribble incontinence. And so once they go to the washroom, they're sort of not able to stop the stream properly because the muscles don't contract or restrict to stop the flow of urine afterwards, or not being able to begin the flow of urine. That's another way that we can see
Hmm.
sort of not necessarily incontinence, but urinary issues. Just to name a few, there's so many, but um, yeah, I think how do we know, how if that person is going to respond or if they're going to benefit from pelvic health? I think it's just a matter of listening to what we call their subjective and like their history. What's been going on? How long has this been happening? Is it something that you recognize as problematic? Um, some people, they don't have a goal of fixing their incontinence. Sometimes that's not within their ability at the moment. Sometimes we don't have like the mental capacity to kind of think about these things as we maybe should in terms of rehab. It takes a lot of mental focus, mental energy, and so sometimes that's not someone's goal, and that's okay. We have to kind of meet people where
Hmm.
they're at. um, but most of the time people will sort of recognize like, oh yeah, I'm peeing myself when I walk, or I lifted my child up and I let go of urine, and I'm not liking that. I had to go change and it's embarrassing at work and all of this stuff. And so I think, addressing the physical component is definitely a big piece of it, but also addressing the mental component around how they feel about what they're experiencing. Some of the techniques that I use include urge delay or ways to sort of like distract yourself. And people are probably not going to respond to those types of techniques if they don't believe that they can hold their urine
Hmm.
properly. Like if you're somebody who this happens daily, and I'm saying to you, oh, just, count backwards from 10 and distract your brain for a little bit, you're going to be like, you're crazy. I'm just going to pee myself. That won't work for me. So it's again that thing of just meeting people where they're at, having like lots of different methods of sort of approaching
Hmm.
these ideas. And then the biggest thing is just education so that people understand like how their psychological comes into uh, how their pelvic floor especially functions because it's so connected to our central nervous system, but also um, where they're at in their day. Do you have so much stress that you don't even have time to think about this, or do you have the capacity to sort of deal with this? Are you emotionally able to tolerate me talking about this in front of
Yeah.
you all the time? And so there's that too, and that's important. But
What are
I don't
some
know if that
other?
answered your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. What other methods do you sort of go through? So you've got the distraction. What other steps do you then take if that one doesn't work?
Yeah, for urgent incontinence, I will sometimes have people. So first of all, learn how to relax their pelvic floor because a lot of the time it has to do with that tension, like way too
Hmm.
much around the bladder. And so we'll teach them how to relax first. So you got to know what that feels like. And then I will often have them use that relaxation or kind of pelvic floor drop technique around the washroom so that if they feel the urge, they can go to the washroom, stand in the stall, take a few deep breaths, try to learn to relax the pelvic floor, see if that deals with the urge or sort of like takes it down a few levels. And part of the reason I have them go to the washroom is that idea of like, oh, I might pee myself if I do this. I'm
Hmm.
not going to do it in my office when there's, people around or something like that. So be close to the washroom and know that, if you still need to go, you're right there and you can do it. And so it takes away a little bit of that stress that comes with it, like the mental stress, I
Hmm.
guess. Um, and then the other thing is, yeah, those like physical distractions that I kind of alluded to earlier. So sometimes I'll have people do like heel raises as they're sitting. Like if you're someone who has a trigger of every time you get in your car, you have to go to the washroom, heel raises in the car, just going up and down, give yourself a little resistance, and sometimes it works more. Um, and then even just kind of like pelvic positioning, pelvic tilts, putting pressure on different areas of your hips and your pelvis can help sort of distract from those sacral nerves and bring your central nervous system or downtrain your central nervous system a little bit away from that signal. Because as long as we know the signal is incorrectly
Mhm.
timed, if that is truly the problem, then you can sort of play around with that signal in many ways. So with like sensory cues, visual cues, that kind of stuff. But it's just what works for the person. And again, you have to, this comes from knowing what their triggers are, what their, their history is. You
Yeah.
have to be able to say like, is this why this is happening? And is this the only reason? Okay, let's do that then. But without knowing a good background on people, sometimes you can sort of like misfire these
Yeah.
types of things, and then they get uncomfortable with the idea of I had an accident at work again and now I'm mad at you. So you got to be careful.
Um, so I previously mentioned that like my lecturer who got me into the area of research that I do, her PhD is on incontinence and how women perceive that. Now,
Yeah.
she's found that there's a huge drop off on women activity in general over the age of 16, but more so after they've had children as well. And it comes from that
Yeah.
idea where because you've had to push a whole human out, or you've had this human grow and putting pressure on that area where it's made it weak. So this whole inactivity coming from it has detrimented the active lifestyles of certain women. How would you sort of postpartum? How would you recommend women try to sort of overcome that incontinence issue? And again, it's not every woman that goes through this, but there is a huge
Yeah.
part that go through it.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think one of the main things that I try to drive home with women is that this is a very serious like trauma. People don't like that word, but it's trauma to the muscles, to the tissues. Whether you had a vaginal birth or a cesarean section, we can say that you've had a very extreme experience around those muscles. If I were lifting in the gym and I just, tore my bicep or tore my rotator cuff, I would not expect to go back immediately. And it's the same thing for the pelvic floor. I think there's this like horrific standard, especially on social media, that people should be like back at it
Mhm.
and moving as quickly as possible.
We have Kim Kardashian to
Um,
thank for
oh my God,
that.
yeah. There's so many. There's so many. Don't even get me started. But they, there's this idea that you need to snap back, and it's just so nonsense to me because we don't have the same ideas around. Like if you got an ACLR, you would never just start running
Mhm.
like 3 weeks post-op. That would be absolutely batshit. So I think that it's important to know, what the muscles go through. Even if it's just like a totally normal, uncomplicated birth, it still is a lot of stretching, a lot of pressure, a lot of changes, as well as the hormone things that happen. So knowing from the patient's perspective, this big thing happened. We probably are well aware of that, but here's what it does to your muscles. That's important to start with. And then making sure that they know that there are specific steps that we can take. And there's good research around this. Like, here's how we start. We want to find those muscles again. Do they work properly? Okay, now here's the next step. And a lot of people attach timelines to these kinds of things, but if we give things to patients in a more functional sort of capacity type of measurement, sort of like, can you do 10-second holds? Can you hold while you're doing a squat? Are you able to do this, this, and this? Okay, now you move on to step 2. Now you move on to step 3. People look at it more as like a, um,
Linear
like
progression type of.
yes, exactly, which is how we would look at almost any other major, either surgery or injury. We would look at it as, and we know this now, we can't really attach timelines to even an ACLR because everyone's a little bit different, and it should be a more functional protocol. Can you do a single leg squat? Okay, now we can start doing this next thing and then this next thing. And I think it's the same idea. So presenting it to people like that sort of takes it out of this like, um, I don't know what it is, but women think of it as shameful if they
Mhm.
can't do things that they were doing prior to delivering a human immediately. But if they know that this is the protocol, this is how we do things, and this is how we have success, and make sure that you have all of the underlying, support systems to do the things that you want to do, high intensity training, running, that kind of stuff, then it takes it out of their negative talk and
Hmm.
negative brain sort of space, I think, a little bit. So that's often like just as a general how I approach these things and sort of like present it as a functional timeline, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah.
With everything that you're mentioning, I've had shoulder reconstruction, so I kind of know some of the psychological work that goes into it as well. How do you find those types of conversations with your female sort of athletes and anyone that comes in for their pelvic floor?
Yeah. I think obviously there's a difference. When it comes to pelvic floor stuff, there's this sort of um, shame, I guess, or there's a different sensation about like, oh, I hurt my knee versus, oh, my pelvic floor hurts or it's not functioning properly. And I think it comes back to that thing that we were just talking about of the like that culture that exists.
Hmm.
But um, yeah, the emotional part is something that I deal with quite often with my patients, and I think that if I were leaving that part out, then we'd be really missing like a lot of the treatment. Um, so first of all, like letting people know that they're not alone in this, and for example, pelvic organ prolapse, they've done studies on this. There's a huge amount of the population. Some
Hmm.
studies suggest over 85% of women
Wow.
experience some level of pelvic organ prolapse. Pain with intercourse after delivering, same thing. There's studies that suggest 85% plus of women experience
Damn.
pain with intercourse after delivering a baby. So you can throw some stats at them. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll expose them to like Facebook groups of moms, or there's pelvic organ prolapse groups, and there's even just like mom groups that exist, especially in Toronto, where people can talk about these things and like experience them with somebody else, so that it feels like there's a little bit less of the like there's something wrong with me, and this is like this weird thing that's happening to me. And I think that that helps a lot, um, just to kind of feel like, yeah, there's other people that experience this, and there's actually a whole bunch of research that involves this thing
Yeah.
that I'm experiencing. Because if you went in somewhere and your doctor was like, "Oh, this is I've never seen this before," that's gonna make you feel pretty uncomfortable with how they're
Yeah.
treating you or not treating you, right? So that's, I think, an important piece of the emotional aspect. The other part of it is knowing how to refer, and having like a really good network of people around you.
Mm.
So I have a few connections to therapists and to people who deal with more of the emotional state, sex therapy, that kind of thing. So just knowing how to send people to the right places is really important, and just like make sure that you, for me, I have such a like specific scope of practice, and while sometimes it like expands and contracts a little bit within a session, I find that if I know how to deal with things by sending people to the right person, that person is experiencing like
Mhm.
actual holistic care, and I think that that's really important. So if I need someone to get a little bit stronger, I might send them to this Pilates instructor who I love. If I need them to get, help with how they're thinking about themselves within this emotionally, I might send them to this therapist who I know deals with these kinds of things. So yeah, that's an important part of it.
Yeah.
And like I try my best to be as empathetic as possible. Um, Obviously within the sessions, and people cry in front of me all the time. I try to say that too. Like this is an emotional thing.
Mhm.
I have people cry sometimes like every day in front of me, and so it's important to be able to like create a space where people feel safe enough to do that as well, and just making sure that they know what to expect from what I
Mhm.
can give them and our experience together. So yeah, you just kind of hope that the space that you create is something where people can share the emotional aspects with you, but you can also tell them where to go in the times where it might be outside of my capabilities.
100%. I
So
think that's very important to recognize as well. Is like you can't treat everything. So having this
yeah,
team to like delegate and make sure that they're the person that's coming to see you has looked at the best way. I think that's really important. Like
yeah,
I know for myself, there's a couple coaches that are within my circle that they specialize in like this one particular thing. So if anyone comes to me
yeah,
and is like, "Oh, I want to do this," I'm like, "Go see him because he's actually the best at doing that, and he'll be able to
yeah,
sort you out better than me." As like I find that really important, specifically when you're trying to build that buy-in and trust with your clients or patients, where it's training and health is a very emotional attached sort of area of everyone's lives. Like I've had people let me into like their biggest fears. They've cried in front of me. Like you see so much within coaching that you kind of have to have that
Yeah,
human aspect of yourself. Show
100%.
is that yeah. So like for me, it's making sure that everyone that I surround myself with within the industry or clients or patients, you can make sure that their health plan is targeted towards them and how to best suit them.
Yeah, totally. And I think like the what you said about making sure that you're human as well is really important. I think one thing that I hear a lot is that, people have been through the medical system, particularly in Canada here, and they've just been, passed around and they've not been really heard. I think that's one thing that I've loved about my job in particular is I can spend enough time with
Mm,
people to truly, I think, hear them, and listen to what are your goals? What do you feel about this? What is this like affecting your life? How do you feel about your relationship because of this? Those kinds of questions I think just make you feel like you're actually there to help that person
mhm,
and hopefully together and that's how I think about physio in general. It's like such a partnership. if
mhm.
if my patient doesn't trust me, um, I'm not going to be able to create a proper plan for them because I'm not going to get the whole story. I'm going to be leaving out little pieces of these puzzles that are humans
Yeah,
and we're already complicated enough. If I don't know the whole thing, I'm just not going to be able to help you in the most accurate and timely manner. So um, yeah, being a human to people is obviously, it sounds so
so mundane,
so baseline, but I don't think a lot of people feel that way. Sometimes, unfortunately, and there's amazing doctors, so I don't want to demonize anybody, but sometimes I've heard stories where they go to their doctor and their doctor's like doesn't even look at them and it's like, yeah, you're fine, you're cleared for whatever you want, you can go back to exercise, you can do all this stuff, and they're like, but I don't feel right.
Mhm,
You're not hearing what I'm saying. So I think just making sure that people feel heard is a big
100%.
part of it.
I
Yeah.
I often say this, and it's that thing of like the honesty is the best way to go about coaching. If someone's like struggling with a certain area, you could be like, actually, like this needs to be addressed like right now, and having that honesty. But also, I think what really drives that buy-in as well is owning up to your mistakes. Like as
Yeah.
coaches, we're not and practitioners, we're not perfect. We will mess up.
No.
So like sometimes
Yeah.
when I'm teaching someone and maybe a cue misses or I've done some or like I've messed up in some degree, I'm like, actually guys, let's stop there. Let's come back in. I fucked up. I'm the problem here.
Hmm.
And like so from now on, let's do it this way. I think this way will work better. And that kind of gets them to be like, actually he's not scared to own up to his mistakes. So if I
Yeah.
mess up, like I can do the same. But at the
Yeah.
same time as well as like and I always make sure that the human side is more important than the coaching side. Like a lot of my athletes on this past Monday, I had two athletes in particular. One PR'd on a squat, but because he failed his two last set, like his last set, he was like really beating himself up on it, like torturing himself inside. And
Yeah.
I was like, "What are you doing?" It's like I failed that set. I was like, "You hit PR, and you were trying to hit PR
Yeah.
for three different sets. Let's think about what's going on here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you've PR'd and you're trying to PR three different times. It's a bit
Yeah.
madness. Like your central nervous system, your peripheral, they're
Oh,
gone. You're gone.
yeah. We need a day. We need a whole day, probably more,
Yeah,
before you're coming back and peer
and like the other one was just
adding
like
to that.
technical elements of the snatch. Like he was in his head. He failed a couple sets, so I like went in and watched them to make sure that the technical side was fine. It was fine. He just needed to be a little bit more explosive. So like he finished his set, he finished his rep on a fail, but the previous rep was like his best rep by far. He nailed it, stuck the landing, came up smooth. He was like, "Can I try it again?" I was like, "No, you've done 5 reps
Yeah.
on your last set."
Yeah.
It's like, Just one more." I was like, "No." He was like, but I failed. He was like, yeah, but how much of your technique did we just change today alone? And you nailed it on your second last. So you're like you're
Yeah.
good. Like you nailed it.
Yeah. Yeah, the nervous system in that context, like so important. You're just not going to, like if you PR, your nervous system is working as hard as possible to get that. And so it's hard though, I think, especially with athletes and
Mm-hmm.
their drive to compete with themselves and compete with others and that kind of stuff. I always say that I have clients who I'm trying to motivate sometimes,
Mm.
and then I have clients who I'm trying to like tie a leash to and hold down because there's different aspects. And I work a lot because I do gait analysis. I work a lot with marathon runners
Mm.
and just runners in general, but um, there's something particular about the marathon distance that gets into people's heads. And so there's this very predictable pattern. As soon as someone finishes their whatever first second marathon or achieves a PB or something like that, um, they are almost always signed up for their next marathon by the time I see them again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started asking people, like when I see people, because we often do sort of like check-ins post race. I'm like, all right, what'd you sign up for?
That's the
um,
first question.
but it's like, exactly. I'm like, what did you do? So yeah, I think you have to be realistic with people, and like you said with your training clients, like if that's the last rep for them, you have to be firm in that, because that's it might not be safe anymore for them to
Hmm.
be PRing. And um, people think that the body has these like limitations that are imposed only by our brains, and maybe there's something to that, but it's also your nervous system has capacities, and it has that for a reason. It's a safety measure
Hmm.
for our muscles and tendons and things to stay healthy. So our job as people who know about that is to make sure that people are informed
Yeah.
enough about it. But
Coach
yeah.
AJ, who I've mentioned a lot here, he was like sort of my mentor in at UW, and there was this one athlete that was like running beyond the normal pace for his position, and like, but we knew he was like really going for it. So he was like running around, and as he passed us, was like, "I've got this! Like I'm going to beat everyone." And like Coach AJ just turned around and was like, "You can't beat science. Like you cannot
Yeah.
beat science." And then sure enough, the next lap he was like within the pack, but like so just keeping up.
Yeah.
And we were just like,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's just we've got a lot of information on this stuff.
Yeah, like it
Yeah.
was such a simple line, but for me, I was like, you nailed it. Like you can be mentally prepared as much as you want. Like
Yeah.
if you're fatigued in some sort of capacity, or if you push beyond like your measures, your will to drive as much as you can only take you so far. Like your body will just be like, nope,
Yeah.
shut up.
Yeah. Exactly. It's such a fine line though, too, right? Like
Hmm.
especially with high performance athletes, because they just want to push themselves to the absolute limit, and like what that limit is, we don't actually know very much about.
Hmm.
And um, for an individual, and I actually listened to a little bit of your episode with Anna Trimble,
Okay.
and she was
Yeah.
talking about like cycle tracking and how it can change your like how you feel day to day. And that's something I've been super interested in for a while, but like especially in females, how they feel one day at the gym might be
Hmm.
entirely different from how they feel the next day, and how much they have like from a nervous system perspective or like a fuel perspective can be entirely different. So, the athlete that's, PRing one day might come to the gym and feel absolutely like flattened
Hmm.
the next day.
100%.
So just, have making sure that people know it can fluctuate. It might not always be that you have your absolute peak capacity available. And yeah.
The interesting thing as well. So I previously mentioned that like my research area is like women's health and menstrual cycles, and how to properly program and sort of make sure that they're taken care of during events and any type of
Hmm.
training considerations that we might need to look at. And what I found myself doing is like menstrual cycle research studies can't be short term. Like it's to only look at one cycle is very sort of weird, because like not one cycle within the same female is alike. Like it changes month to month to month to month, and
Yeah.
within that then you've got the different types of women. So women, not one women's cycle is the exact same as sort of like say your best friend, you just don't
Yeah.
have the same cycle.
100.
If we looked at 1,000 women, you just probably wouldn't have the same cycle. So it's
Yeah.
this thing where through research, because it's so hard to pinpoint what's going down, like hormonally, like psychological, like physiological. There's so many factors to it that you cannot just pinpoint one thing. So a lot of
Yeah.
what I've been doing is like just making questionnaires and like these training plans where for me the most thing that I look at is like nutrition, what's going on nutritionally that we can identify. Coffee is a big one for sort of knocking off the menstrual cycle in a different way. Like you could be late because you've just drank coffee. That's wild. And
Mm.
I've noticed this because like there's one person that I've given this diary to, and I noticed that she was having monsters like every single day. And then on top of that, she'd have coffee. And I was like, so not only are you having like
Oh
this
my.
really high dosage of caffeine every single day within the monsters, but you're supplementing that with more caffeine. Like
Yeah.
she was like, that's the
Oh
only
yeah.
way I can function, I can work. Like it wasn't even that she was irregular. She just wouldn't stop bleeding. Like she hadn't stopped
Mm.
bleeding for like almost a year. So for us, I was like,
Ugh,
let's cut off coffee or caffeine in general. So coffee,
yeah.
monsters, let's cut that out.
Monsters. Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
she came back the month after, and she was like, normal, I'm good.
Oh wow.
And I was like,
Yeah.
it's that so like nutrition plays a huge role on it. But then we
Yeah.
kind of
It's
look of sorry. Then we kind of look at your energy levels before and after a session. Like how are they impacted, and what is your perception of the session as well? Like
yeah.
if you're on your period, we'll say, and you've got this hard session, chances of you're going to talk yourself out of that session before you even get to the venue. Like, and I'm not saying that like that's for every female, but that's what I found majority of the time. Like the two
Yeah.
weeks before, strong as hell, PR, do everything you can. Week off, you're kind of in that slump, and you're sort of again at the risk of sounding sexist, a little bit more sensitive, and
Yeah. Well, I think like neurologically more sensitive. Like there are physiological changes that create sensitivity. So
yeah.
yeah, we can say
See,
that.
yeah, but, like that's the thing. Like we can say that because we know what's happening.
I know.
Um,
Yeah.
and that
We're
like,
not
I feel like
emotionally
I have
insensitive.
to disclaim everything because I'm a man, and it's
Yeah.
very weird because I get really big imposter syndrome from it. But like, there's so many things that can contribute to one session that like it's just hard to program for female athletes, and because these elements have never been implemented, women don't know that they exist.
No, it's such an interesting area. I became interested in cycle tracking about 2 years ago. Um, I think a lot of the reason, or part of the reason, maybe I won't blame it all on this, but part of the reason why women don't know much about like how they feel and how fluctuations happen is a lot of my generation of females have been put on birth control or oral contraceptives or contraceptives that actually interrupt like natural flow of hormones, which is functional in certain ways, and I think that it can be wonderful. So not to say that it's
Mhm.
not the right thing to do, but it doesn't give us very much information about how we feel based on what's happening in our cycle. And there's this awesome book by Alyssa Vitti called In the Flow.
Yeah, Anna
Um,
Trimble recommended
have you?
that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and she sort of like breaks down um, like the certain factors that you're talking about. Caffeine is one of them, and like how you're eating certain foods. Yeah. And a lot of it is like, stuff that might not apply to people, but I think there's some great information in there about just like what factors influence your hormones. And the best thing that you can do is inform yourself about your own
Mhm.
body. So if that gives us a little bit of information about like the fuel that you're consuming affecting how you feel that day, or affecting your performance even, or knowing about like, are you about to peak because you have a bunch of estrogen in your body and so your muscles have a little bit more power that day or a couple of days. um, it helps take it out of, again, that like mental state of like, oh, there's something wrong with me today, or like I just suck today.
Mhm.
Like having more information about these things can be really helpful, just in terms of like planning and performance. um, and just in overall life, like
Yeah,
knowing about your body is so important. And it's something that, because birth control was so widely accepted as the normal, and like I said, it's important in a lot of ways, but it's also important for us to know a lot about ourselves. So if people are okay with learning how to cycle track and like taking on the risks that are associated with that, it can be a really beneficial method of
yeah,
understanding your own body and your own performance and stuff like that. So
100%.
yeah.
How do you sort of keep track of yours and the different stages that you're on?
Yeah, I use an app and a like temperature reading every morning. I basically I do it like before I do anything else,
Mhm.
before I start scrolling on my phone in the morning. You're supposed to do it like immediately when you wake up so that you're at the same like kind of
Yeah,
basal temperature before your metabolism kicks in. And so I've been doing that. I know lots of people use like the Aura ring. I don't know if you've heard of that.
yeah.
It's like a yeah, wearable device, and that can be really helpful. I think it's more accurate because it's on you constantly,
Mhm,
and so it might have a better idea of how you fluctuate. So we know that there are temperature spikes associated with ovulation, and so that helps us understand like where we are within the cycle. And once you have a bit of an idea of what yours looks like, you can kind of see the differences week to week. Is this an ovulatory cycle? Is this an anovulatory? So maybe I have more estrogen, less estrogen, all of that stuff kind of comes into play. But the biggest thing for me was tracking down what I was feeling as well. This was a really interesting sort of learning experience. And I, would have these days during the month where I felt kind of like down and flat and like I didn't have very much motivation. And then some days where I felt like I could literally take on the world. And it was very
mhm,
confusing. And then I looked back once I started doing this. Like I said, I've been doing it for about 2 years. I looked back and I was sort of like, this happens once a month around the same time in my cycle every time. And so being able to see that play out and how my hormones are affecting that is, I think, powerful. And,
mhm.
a lot of women think of periods as like these things that make us less capable and less functional. But if you can understand them, it gives you a little bit of power in controlling your day to day and controlling your performance. So
Yeah, I think it's something that I'm still trialing just now. So like I know there's still a lot of work I need to do on it. But I think that's like a resource that I'm just going to make available, is like having this type of diary that includes some of the performance side of it. I also have no idea how to put that out there. So it's something that I'm still tinkering with, and I've got a couple people on it on the program. So depending on the results, it's something that I might think about releasing. But it's like
that's
it's
awesome.
what you're saying is like the tracking element is the best way that you can keep track on what's happening. I know that the Apple Watch 8 onwards is a good way as well, because like they've got built-in heat sensors as well, so they
Yeah.
can take your skin temperature and they can
Yeah.
accurately depict when you're going to come on and off your cycle. Like I think Apple is actually, as much as I hate to say this, Apple has actually got a really good way of identifying people's health and how their health metrics are working with each other. But
Hmm.
Aura Ring's a good one as well. I'm not sure if Whoop has anything to that extent.
Oh, that's a good question. I I don't know either, but I would hope that they do, because a
Yeah,
lot of people, that's a more comfortable. I
hmm,
find like Apple Watch, you have to charge it so often that it's a little bit
annoying.
um annoying.
We can
But
say it.
yeah, sorry Apple, I love you, but but yeah, the Whoop, I know like it's a comfortable band, and so people
Hmm.
don't take it off very often, and then you get a lot of recovery information from it. So
Yeah, I've got a love hate relationship with Whoop. I
yeah,
really like the basic information that they're providing is really good, and for athletes that just need to know the recovery rates and what's happening with them, amazing. But
yeah,
also for people like me who care a little bit more about the statistics side of it, they don't actually provide with how they come up with these stats and figures. So for me, I'm just like, is where are you getting this number from? Like, what is this
yeah,
based off of? Like, I've tried to recreate it on Excel and I've gone to a certain degree of it, but
yeah,
like, there's so many. independent variables where everyone is different. Like I could function really well on 6 hours, which you might function really well on 10 hours. But like, how are they coming up? And like, yes, that they hold so much information on you over a duration of time that it can become more specific to you. But then that could still not be as accurate as you might think.
100%. I've always wondered how they calculate your VO2 max as well. I've been curious about
That's one
that.
of them. That is one
As
of them.
someone who did my undergrad in kid and has done VO2 max testing, I'm like, that's a hard thing to get
Hmm.
from all the
Like,
way a wrist. So
yeah, like I'm terrible at VO2 maxes, but put me in
yeah,
incremental tests, I can go just as long, which
right.
doesn't make sense. Like, and I've found this in heat chambers as well. Like we did incremental testing on heat chambers, and I do well in heat. Most people don't. So like,
Yeah.
it's just one of those that like everyone's so different and unique that I looked at Whoop, like Apple Health and all that stuff as like just an average of what you can
Yeah.
do, and like then I started trying to determine what I'm actually on, which is a little bit harder. Polar does a really good
Yeah.
job of keeping up with everything. I will say
Oh
that
yeah.
Polar
Yes.
is fantastic.
Garmin, I think like they've got
Garmin's good
sometimes
too.
you can attach the polar heart rate monitors with your Garmin, but a lot of my runners use Garmin. It gives you a lot of detailed
Mhm.
information, even just like with respect to
Pace and
your
yeah,
cadence, your step length, that kind of stuff, which is really fun. Sometimes we'll just spend like a few minutes looking at people's stats from their from their Garmin. It's interesting. But yeah, I've always been confused by some of the statistics that come out of it because, as we know from research, like gathering data is not as simple as just like slapping something on
mhm.
somebody's wrist. So yeah, it's always intriguing,
And
but
then there's
we
that
need something.
yeah, but like I think it's a really good way of starting.
Yeah.
Um, and like there's also the factor of like it depends where you have it on your body. It's like I'm going to mess up this stat, but I think it's like there's a 40% variable difference from the wrist to the chest strap, which
Yes.
is quite significant. If
It's huge.
I think it's
Yeah.
40, I could be absolutely butchering that. But it's
Oh,
something quite significant where like there's a degree of variable there that can completely skew from like wrist to chest strap as well.
yeah, it's interesting. I think like for maybe the average person or your sort of like gen pop athlete type of person, it might not matter so much. But if we're talking about like peak performance
Mm,
and marathons and like training in specific zones and that kind of stuff, like it starts to matter a little bit more.
100%. Like
Even in like an older population, if you're trying to keep people in like a very specific heart
mm,
rate range and you are off by 40%, that's a big deal. So
I will re say that I could be
yeah,
wrong now.
maybe it's not 40, but if
Like it's still like it's still significant enough
yeah.
to matter. Like that's another question I sort of had was that like what's the advice and help that you give out for athletes who have gone through pregnancy and now are wanting to start competing again?
Yeah, I think my main piece of advice is in the initial, usually 8 to 12 weeks, just rest and move in ways
Mm,
that feel good and try not to push yourself in that time. Um, the other thing to like keep in mind, especially with female athletes who are breastfeeding, your muscle capacity and your elasticity and all of that stuff might still be affected by the fact that you have these different hormones that allow you to breastfeed circulating. And so, training to build muscle capacity in this time might not yield the same effects as if it were outside of the time that we
mm,
are breastfeeding. And so, like keeping those changes in mind, that's really important. So my biggest piece of advice is like take the time to rest properly and allow yourself to recover fully. Try not to rush back into it. I think a lot of athletes, female athletes, um, really want to run as soon
mm.
as possible. I had someone um, message me a couple of weeks postpartum, very few weeks postpartum, and she was like, "I'm thinking I'd like to start some easy jogs soon. What do you think of that?" And I was like, No. Just flat out, not yet. And I think like in general, I'm a very like it depends kind of person, which is just so typical of physios. But um, it 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 does depend, but we just know that you need approximately 6 weeks for tissues to
Hmm.
heal properly and, reduce the risk of infection. And that's just like baseline, we're not going to have tissue problems, hopefully. And then for your strength to kind of return, we would expect that to take quite a bit longer. And then for you to actually build muscle capacity and like rate of force production and, like athletic
Mm.
abilities, it could be a lot longer. So I think just not rushing into those things is really important so that you get the proper progression of things. And like we talked about, that functional sort of
Hmm.
progression is the most important. Can you do this? Okay, now do that. Now, can you do this? We move on.
What would be
So
some low hanging fruit when they start to sort of be ready to exercise?
um, I like to see core strength to begin with.
Mm.
So
With the
obviously,
expanding and then coming back. Yeah.
yes, yeah. We some changes that we just know with pregnancy is abdominal wall extension or distension, and so if you cannot translate forces across your abdominal wall properly, you probably cannot lift things overhead very efficiently. You might not be able to produce force while running properly. And so anything that requires like a full body movement, if the core is not participating in it, then we're a little worried about what that looks like long term, right? Something else
Mm.
might compensate, other areas of the body might have to work harder. Um, and you're just not going to get that peak performance out of those groups. And so, yeah, core is like my bread and butter,
Yeah.
my number one sort of like low hanging. So one of the I talked about that sort of like return to run protocol, and um, one of the pieces of that is can you hold a plank for a minute in like long plank positioning, which is harder than it sounds. So, and we have to be positioned properly, making sure that like pelvis is tucked under, all that jazz. And then yeah, the other pieces of that are basically like single leg squats, quick double leg squats, like to the a beat of a metronome, usually
Mm.
around like 80 beats per minute or something of that nature. Say it's running. Oftentimes we'll use a metronome because we have to produce like fast contractions. So yeah, low hanging fruit, I would say core and then hip stability. Those things are sort of
Yeah.
where I start to focus.
What's the keys on the hip and how that performs?
I like to see at least functional internal rotation, which might differ depending on like your sport or what you're doing. So internal rotation tells me a lot about how the hip capsule is functioning. Is it able to do sort of this complex movement? If we have internal rotation, we probably have a little bit of hip extension available as well. And so it's one of those foundational movements that we
Hmm.
pay a lot of attention to in physio. And then I also like to see at least resistance to like manual testing against like a lateral pressure. So can your glute med resist like most of my body weight pushing into you? Can you hold a side plank in that sort of like lateral dominant position? And then we have at one of the clinics I work at, we have a force bar, which I'm
Mm.
so lucky to be able to use. Josh might have talked about it. But we're able to sort of compare side to side as well with that, and then against your percentage of body weight with that muscle group. So we can sort of see like, are you significantly different on one hip to the other? And does it make sense with respect to your current body mass is as a sort of like general percentage of the body? Yeah, hips, we want to see like glute med is active, hip extension, especially for running. A little bit
Mm.
of hip extension is goes a long way.
Yeah.
And so those things I look at quite a lot. The other thing that I look at though is just how do you perform some of these movements? Like, what does it look like when you do a squat?
Mm.
Um, and, are you able to control for a kettlebell held in front of you? Can you keep your core upright in that position? Some of those like more fundamental movements tell me a lot about what is going on just as a general sense. Are like you
Yeah.
talked about the knees collapsing, what's happening at your feet? Are you having to pronate to get yourself down there? Um, and I think, yeah, just kind of knowing how that might translate to the person's sport if it's running or
Hmm.
if it's, let's say, weightlifting or that kind of thing. Those are the two things that I probably see the most, people wanting to get back to weightlifting and running. So in general, I'll have them, you know, before I would clear them, we do those things together. Like I'll put them on a treadmill
Yeah.
and see what happens, or I'll put them in under a squat, like a barbell, and watch them squat or deadlift or whatever it is. So
Would
yeah,
this advice be the same for women who go through C sections,
yeah.
or is there any difference between your way of sort of programming these differences?
I think with C sections, I tend to see a little bit less of the actual pelvic floor.
Hmm.
Mm, I was going to say pelvic floor dysfunction, but it's just different. A lot of the time with vaginal births, we see um, hypertonicity, so like too much tone because of the, possible birth injuries, that kind of stuff. But with C-sections, I often see inactivity of those muscles, so they're just a little bit less online, like we talked about before, around the scar tissue, because our brains are sort of like, well, don't use that, don't touch
Hmm.
that area. So I see a lot of like anterior pelvic tilts, that sort of like dumped forward posture, because people can't engage some of that anterior abdominal wall, and a little bit of anterior pelvic floor musculature can be affected as well. It's different. I would say C-section, because that is a surgery. We've gone through the muscles. We've actually caused physical injury to those muscles, and so they need time to recover. And for someone who, let's say, is returning to running, I don't really want to see them doing any like contractile work until minimum 8 weeks, because we know that tissue takes a little bit longer to heal, and there's sometimes changes with scar tissue that make it so that the muscle is not as capable for a longer period of time. So yeah, we extend those timelines sometimes a little bit, but in general, past the point where you're able to, move and use your core a little bit, then it looks somewhat similar. I would just say in the first like initial postpartum phases to the time where you start to move a little bit, that's a little bit of a lengthened period usually, for that reason. But yeah, I think C-sections, a lot of people opt for these, or ask about opting for these, because they perceive that you'll have less dysfunction
Hmm.
after. And I can't really agree with that. I would say it's just different functional changes. So maybe a little bit less incontinence, perhaps. We don't know how that necessarily plays out, but more so in terms of abdominal wall stuff, we'll
Yeah.
see issues related to that.
Is that something that you've sort of identified through time, that these differences occur from each other?
Yeah, I think through time, I've also done cesarean section recovery courses, and specifically what that looks like from a rehab focus. So we know a little bit about like long term um, differences between the two, but yeah, I think what I see in clinic is so individual. It's always really
Mm.
hard to say is one better than the other. Obviously, if you're having a C-section, there's a medical reason, most likely, that you're having that C-section. And so I try not to say like, well, this is a better outcome than this one. And I just don't believe that that's entirely true anyways. It's just different. Like we might have to prepare a little bit differently. We might have to have a little bit of a different rehab protocol afterwards, but there's no necessarily like pros and
Hmm.
cons that are totally outweighing in one scenario to the
Yeah.
other. So
No. Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on. I've stayed
thank you.
quiet for a lot because I truly just want to listen to what you were saying and really capture
It's
what you
been
were saying.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. Honestly, this is really fun, and I think I was telling Josh when you asked if I might be interested. I was like, well, you can't shut me up about this stuff, so
No, I think
I'll keep
that's
talking.
that's one of the messages that we exchanged was like you were worried that you were just going to go on and on and on. I was like, I want you to. You are
Yeah,
good.
yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's really fun to have like a platform to talk about this stuff on, and I
No,
think you're doing such a great job of it.
thank you. No, like for me, it's like what I was saying in the beginning is like I want everyone to have access to this information, and if I can provide people with the opportunity to listen to who I think are good in this space and that general topic and subject, I think it's it'd be stupid of me not to sort of have people like you on, where this is your thing and this is like where you've spent most of your time on. Like, I really, for me as well, this is very selfish. I love to learn new things. So
Yeah,
having people like you where I can just let you go off and sort of pick your brain on different areas of it, I personally love it. So thank you for coming on.
awesome. Yeah, it's been super fun.
Do you want
Always.
to plug anything or sort of let people know where they
Oh,
can reach you?
yeah, honestly, I'm the worst social media person ever, but I do have it in Instagram. It's PT with AD, and basically you'll just find me being a little bit of an idiot on there with Josh, as you can see. I hope to post a little bit more in the next couple of months. I think it's a really fun way, like you said, to just like put your knowledge out there and have people learn things that you're interested in. And so hopefully I can do a little bit more of that. But that's all we have for now. So
100%. No, that's perfect. If anyone listening as well has experienced or is experiencing any type of incontinence or pelvic health issues, I would love if they could reach out to you as well. Like this, I think it would be
yeah.
amazing for them to sort of be in contact with someone that can help that area.
Oh, totally. And yeah, we do virtual sessions at both clinics that I work at, and we also do, complimentary assessments, like a 15-minute just consult. So if people have questions and they're like, I just don't know if this is a problem, a lot of physios do that. I do that, and we'd love to talk to you. Most pelvic physios, you can't get us to stop talking about it. So we love to hear from you guys.
No, perfect. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. All right, enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Peace.